Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Thank you for joining us tonight. It is a hilarious truth about Washington that I come before you tonight to lead off my cable newscast with the following news.
Hi, Mr. Hayes. Thank you so much for sitting down with the Brown Political Review. We really appreciate this. When you were a student, was there more ability for students to get change than there is now?
I think actually, in some ways, there's probably a lot more ways to get things done, and there's like more avenues to put pressure. There's the fact that you have the ability to publicize things that are happening on campus to anyone in the world who has an internet connection, and that didn't exist necessarily when I was there. I mean, it did, but it was not. It was kind of in its infancy.
You say education as a great equalizer is more of a myth than a reality.
You know, I think it's completely self-delusional to think that the way that we're going to get a more equal society is that, you know, we're going to have these channels by which more and more kids from the South Bronx, you know, or East St. Louis are going to end up at Brown University. So I guess the point is that if your vision for how you're going to correct the vast, growing, accelerating inequalities of American life center wholly on education, then you're doing it wrong.
So then what do we have to do?
You just need much more, frankly, squarely egalitarian policies that fundamentally redistribute wealth. Like, the first thing to do is just do things like really raise marginal tax rates and maybe something like a guaranteed basic income. But I would be happy if we just snatched the low-hanging fruit. And for instance, every child in America is born with some sort of asset wealth, right? This idea of baby bonds, which has been floated as a policy. But of course, it's the same political system that produces that inequality that also produces a set of political incentives and institutions opposed to really egalitarian measures.
So you don't believe that the answer is education reform?
No. So the old liberal way of thinking about this problem, like the kind of like caricatured, say, mid-20th century liberal way about thinking of this problem, is that poverty and inequality produce bad education, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you've got huge concentrations of poverty, if you've got neighborhoods where there's no work, where there is not opportunities for steady employment or social mobility, et cetera, you will produce bad schools, right? Yeah. The new way of thinking, that's been flipped on its head. It's bad schools that are causing poverty. Right. And I just don't think I think actually the old way of looking at it was the better way. I mean, you know, we are now in, let's be very clear, we're now in year 12 of the grand school reform experiment. No Child Left Behind, all this stuff. The child poverty rate is the highest it's been in recent memory, right?
So I wanted to move on to the military. You talked about it as the last trusted institution in America. But right now we're having the sexual abuse scandal break out. What does it mean that this pillar is now crumbling?
I do think that what's fascinating is the more we learn about the epidemic of sexual assault in the military, the more that we see manifestations of the kinds of institutional dysfunction that we've seen in other failed institutions. To me, the one that's most striking and the one that I spent a tremendous amount of time working on for my book is the Catholic Church. You know, the Catholic Church, you have this extremely widespread problem of serial child rape in the most gruesome, abhorrent fashion. I mean, the big problem in the church was that basically everything was handled through canon law, right? The church is all an internal law, as opposed to doing what citizens should do is when you find out that there's an adult preying on children, you call the police, you report them. In the case of the military, I mean, you have an identical problem. It's not actually going through the normal criminal procedures, right? It's working its way up through the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And that code of justice, like canon law, is sort of this self-preservation mechanism for the institution, as opposed to a mechanism designed to actually produce accountability. Because we also have to keep in mind that, like, you know, sexual assault in civilian society outside the military is ridiculously common in America. I mean, the statistics are insane. So it's not even clear to me that as just as an empirical statement that it's worse in the military than it is outside, which itself is a sort of horrifying truth. Ultimately, though, the solution is cultural, right? Like, a society or a culture that fully valued women as equal would not have the problem with sexual violence that we have.
What's the future of media?
What is the future of media? I would be a really, really
Really, really wealthy man, if I knew the answer to that. So there's two possibilities broadly. There have been societies in the history of human civilization in which there was an entire professional class of people who were poets. Like, poetry was an incredibly valued thing. People paid money to hear poets perform, and there was like a profession called being a poet. It's like a professional thing you could do. That doesn't really exist in American life anymore. It is possible that journalism goes the way of poetry. It's possible that it's just a historically contingent accident, that the practice of doing the thing that journalists do was socially valued and market valued enough that it produced a revenue stream that made it possible to be a thing that people did full time. So one possibility is that like journalism ends up like poetry. I think that is incredibly unlikely. I have no idea if cable news host will be a job when I'm 39. I genuinely don't know the answer.
What's the future of mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this incredible balkanization that's happening. You know, audiences just get smaller and smaller each year. So there's a few things I think that are gonna happen. One is that the idea of like time-pegged programming is gonna go out the window. Like the idea that there's these shows that are on at a certain time, like no, that's just not gonna be true anymore. There's one way of imagining what happens to, say, television or cable news that looks like what happens to the music industry, which is just annihilated, right? The entire industry was just destroyed. And now there's just no money in it. And the entire revenue model had to switch from albums or CDs to touring, right? Maybe something like that happens to television. I have no idea.
Well, it's the first time in polls that it seems that the American public is choosing liberty over security. So is there possibly a change in the American perception?
Yeah, I do think, yes, I hope so. I mean, I think that, I thought the reaction to the Boston Marathon bombing was on the whole pretty good in that respect. And people weren't freaking out. The polling was showing that people were more concerned about overreach. So I think there's a lot of promise in that respect.
So you're optimistic about the future?
Always.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate it.